So we're recording now. So yeah, and thank you very much, Tim, for coming in and sharing for us. And please, could you share for us on Concept 12? Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic and a member of Al-Anon. Just FYI, the Al-Anon concept of is slightly different, but the way it's laid out, but the essence is the same. Although this concept covers how the General Service Conference operates, it really governs the whole of the AA service structure. So I'm just going to take it word by word. So general warranties of the conference. What this really means is these are a general overriding principles. There are lots of specific procedures embedded in the other concepts, whereas these ones overarch all of them. They're, as it were, the reason why the other 11 concepts are in place. They rank higher. They're harder to change. The General Service Conference shall observe the spirit of the AA tradition. There's the most frightful phrase which gets used in AA. I'm going to start off as I mean to go on slightly controversial. When people talk about traditions breaches, the traditions are not laws, they're principles. They can't be breached in the same way that a sign saying stay off the grass can be breached. They're of a different order. And there was a situation, don't tell anyone what I'm about to say. There's a situation years ago where there are roving conferences which take AA's name, but are not subject to the custodial oversight of AA. And sometimes they go very wrong and get into the public eye and damage AA's reputation. There have been very serious damages to AA's reputation in Las Vegas and in Dublin because of various conferences which take the AA name but are not under its operational financial supervision. And I wrote a paper many years ago for the General Service Board on the application of the concepts to this situation of this conference, which would be hosted in various different European cities. There are American equivalents of such conferences as well, which rove around. And the spirit of the AA traditions and concepts is very, very clear. Whenever I'm doing anything and I'm calling it AA, at group level is slightly different, but at the level of service, if I'm calling it AA, I'm under the supervision and custodial oversight of the fellowship as a whole, which means I can be removed from my role. These conferences are not subject to that. They've got their own separate financial and legal structure. They couldn't be brought into the structure even if they tried. They'd have to. There is a way of doing it which I won't go into, and it provoked, as might be expected, a little bit of a backlash from one of these conference organizations. And there was a very legalistically worded response. And this is the point. The spirit of this is very, very clear. If you call it AA, you put AA in charge, you're the servant, and it's yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir, to the service structure. The group conscience tells you what to do. If you don't like it, write a little Concept 5 complaint. But this matter shouldn't such matters, although you can go into the traditions and the concepts in detail, they must be solved at the level of spirit. They must be solved at the level of an honest intention to follow the spirit of what this is about, rather than twisting the traditions and the concepts to justify what you've already decided to do. And I think there is a reflection here of a general spiritual danger of using spiritual knowledge, lines from the literature to justify unpleasant behavior. And there was an example a few months ago I saw where there was this poor little newcomer who was still wasn't even dry. He'd had a drink that day and he was trying to taper and he was having a rough time. And someone took the line from the book, I think it's from Alcoholic Anonymous #3, where they ask the chap in the bed, "Do you want to quit for good and for all?" And so this person at fellowship said to the newcomer, "Well, are you willing to quit for good and for all?" And the chap said, "Oh, I don't know." And the AA member said, "Well, I better go off and carry on drinking. And when you're ready, you can come back." Wrong tone, frankly, with this little newcomer. It took about 10 minutes to re-establish a human relationship with this person at the table. And I've heard that kind of approach defended in a legalistic sense by quoting this tradition or that line from the book, but it's against the spirit. The spirit is one of uh, loving the person, putting yourself in their shoes and trying to help them into AA rather than erecting artificial barriers. Anyway, so the General Service Conference shall observe the spirit of the AA tradition. So one's got to rise above the wordings of traditions and concepts and go to what it's really about, which is carrying the message, God in charge, working through us. We're not in charge. That's the overall spirit of this. Taking great care that the conference never becomes the seat of perilous wealth or power. And that principle of avoiding concentrations of power, that operates throughout the whole structure. And it also is what governs all sorts of more specific principles in AA. For instance, principle of rotation. Again, the spirit of rotation has to be followed. It's not just a case of what happens at intergroups sometimes is someone gets onto the intergroup and they rotate out of role A immediately into role B, and they rotate out of role B into role C. And they're observing as it were, the law of rotation, but not the spirit. Because you've got to get out for a while. And a good example of this is at national subcommittee level. If you're on a subcommittee and you serve out your term, there's a period you're not allowed to be on another subcommittee. You have to be put out to pasture to let someone else do the job. And I went to a meeting many, many years ago. And there was a chap who's doing the tea who I shall call Norbert. It wasn't his name, but I shall call him Norbert. And Norbert did the tea at this meeting, and by God, did he do the tea. He had little tea cakes and biscuits stacked in these elaborate piles, all very decorative. Look at Angkor Wat, it was amazing. And he'd get to the end of his term, and the group would say, "Who'd like to take over the tea commitment?" And Norbert would glare round the room, so no one would take it on. Then about 3 weeks later, Norbert would say, "Oh, well, if no one wants to do it, I suppose I'll do it." All sort of sad. Then the next week, you could see he was excited. He got what he wanted. He was the tea person again. He was the best tea person in London. Occasionally, someone who didn't know better put their hand up, and they would have to go through such a period of perilous instruction at the hands of Norbert that within 2 or 3 weeks, they disappeared. We never saw them again, and back was Norbert there. And as far as I'm aware, he's still doing it 20 years later. He's did it for a good 10 years that I was aware. And it's not good. It's not good. I had the same home group for too long, and I just left. My presence was causing more harm than good, so I just left. And I'm back. I took 2 years out, and I'm back now. And it's all right. There's also, for instance, in the structure of conference, got 16 regions in Great Britain, 6 delegates each. Then you've got a board, and you've got various other people who are allowed to vote. And the conference delegates massively outnumber the trustees. Now, the trustees have got a huge tactical advantage at conference. There's a principle I don't much like, and I won't go into why it's there, but there's a principle in operation on the board. It's a little bit like Las Vegas. What happens in the board stays in the board. So one's not allowed to disclose if one's a board member what happens at board meetings unless a particular disclosure is agreed by the board. So they've got all of the information. There are all sorts of things they don't disclose, I think, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for other reasons. So there's a massive tactical advantage when deciding on any question. The delegates will often vary greatly in length of sobriety, duration of service, experience of the fellowship, knowledge of the fellowship. The trustees have been delegates before. They may have been trustees for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. They've been on national subcommittees usually for years. So you've got to have a really hefty majority on the part of the delegates to make sure that the trustees can't manipulate outcomes. If it was much closer to 50-50, any manipulation would swing it in favour of whatever the board wanted to get done. You can't do that with the structure we have in Great Britain. And in another country, which will remain nameless for political reasons, they had a very bad structure in that there were so few delegates that the board basically could pull rank on the delegates at conference, so the conference was no longer exercising any custodial oversight over the board because the board would just outvote them. And there was a sitting general secretary, who'd been there for donkey's years, who knew everything. And when anyone objected to anything, this person would say, well, if you've been in the role as long as I have, you'd know that ... And this happened in 1987, and this happened in 1993, because no one else was there then. No one could gainsay her. And she was ultimately, they changed the structure. They got more delegates in place. Pressure was placed, and she walked before it got legal. But you can have real problems if this is not implemented in the structure. And the danger is having, as it were, sitting tenants at intergroup and region, and it is better to let the vacancies sit there and embarrass everyone than to fill them with the same people again and again and again and again and again. Taking care that the conference never becomes the seat of perilous wealth or power. Wealth. So a group should keep 2 months of expenses, and ditto further up the structure. You've got to have cash flow forecasts at intergroup and region. You hold a little bit more back, but everything should get channeled to the big pot in the sky, as it were, what is being held and managed by the General Service Office. So you keep what you need and you pass the rest on automatically, and that will save an awful lot of ding-dongs at intergroup and region. Sometimes people say, but why can't we spend the money that we've got at intergroup locally? Surely it would be better. Absolutely. But you don't keep it back hoping that someone's going to have a bright idea. There's the danger is that people just find something to spend it on, which is not good. But because you've allocated the money in advance of the plan, people feel very bad about saying no when the money is there. So it must be done the other way around. You come up with a good plan and then you hold back money in order to pay for it. It's the only when it's done the other way around, it's insane decisions get made. So automatically just pass the money on through. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about concept 12 in one's own life, but I'm going to do the technical bit first. That sufficient operating funds plus an ample reserve be its prudent financial principle. So that's 2 years of funding at the level of big corporate bodies like the charity of AA in Great Britain. And you've got to have not just a reserve to cover your operating expenses. That's the ample reserve just in case the inflow of funds collapses for some reason, as happened during COVID. So it's lucky that there was an ample reserve there. But what it means when it says sufficient operating funds plus an ample reserve is the operating funds, it's enough of a buffer so that as the cash inflows don't match the cash outflows across the year, there are peaks and troughs of various things. And so to cover that, that's the sufficient operating funds. The ample reserve is 2 years on top of that. And people misunderstand this and start squawking at conference without having read the accounts properly, because it looks at first glance that the board is holding back more than 2 years. And it's because what it's holding back is two elements: operating funds and an ample reserve. But it shouldn't be more than that, because the only thing which will encourage the board to come into line if it's doing a rotten job is if it's going to run out of money, and unless it does what conference wants, the regions will instruct their constituent intergroups, and indeed themselves will not send funds through to York. So that's why you mustn't build up more than 2 years of an ample reserve, because it's the power of the purse that keeps the board in check. That none of its conference members shall ever be placed in a position of unqualified authority over any of the others. There is one exception in the structure to that, where there is almost unqualified authority. And that's the anomalous position of the subcommittee chair. And I'll explain what I mean. I may have mentioned this earlier on, but I'll cover it again. If region sets up a subcommittee to run an event, and the region appoints a chair to that subcommittee, the chair then, by whatever means, gets all sorts of other people to come onto that committee by invitation or putting it out to tender or whatever. So you end up with a bunch of people on the subcommittee to run the event, but the chair of that subcommittee is answerable to the region that voted them in, not the members of the subcommittee. So a subcommittee chair has very strong authority over the subcommittee. It's in parallel as well. The board subcommittee is the board members in charge. Now, for that exercise of power, the reason it's not really unqualified is that authority is checked not by the subcommittee but by the region. So this is very different in a group. If you have a chair of a group and the chair buggers up, the group can remove them. Whereas if the subcommittee chair buggers up, it's not the subcommittee members that remove them, it's the region, and the subcommittee members can appeal directly to the region to sort it out. So there's a slight anomaly there. And the reason this is so important is because if there's a real conflict in the subcommittee, as the chair, you have to put your foot down, say to the person on the subcommittee that's kicking up a stink, you didn't elect me to this post, so I'm not accountable to you. I'm accountable behind me to the whole region. So I'm going to disagree with you on this one, and you can hold me to account with them, but you as a group can't override me. That all important decisions be reached by discussion, vote, and whenever possible by substantial unanimity. And now, substantial unanimity, in practice, if you've got an administrative decision, you don't worry too much. For instance, shall we finish the meeting at, let's say it's an intergroup meeting at 12 or at 1? You have to go with a majority, simple majority, because if you don't, you can end up with an impasse and you can't decide when the meeting is going to end. If let's say you have a 2/3 and you get 60%, stalemate. So with procedural decisions which can only go one way or the other and which have to be resolved, you go with 50. Anything else, 2/3. Anything which is a real question of policy. So if you want to change the structure of what a group does, 3/4. But honestly, that's spiritually not good enough. I think the principle is to, and this is what I was saying earlier about the principle, the spirit of this, is you want to create motions, have ideas, make changes, which basically pretty much the whole board can get behind. So when you look at decisions made at conference, they tend to get passed with like 90–95%. If it's much below 90%, you're not finished discussing. Carry on looking at how is it possible, listen out for the minority opinion. Is it possible to modify the motion in such a way to bring people on board? And rather than going for a radical change, forcing it through at 2/3, go for a more modest change and get it through at 90%, because group unity trumps anything. What have we got next? That no conference action ever be personally punitive or an incitement to public controversy. Now that public controversy is obviously outside AA, but there is the question of controversy within AA and things being personally punitive in AA. There was a situation a few years ago where a chap chaired an intergroup meeting at the last minute. So the chair didn't show up, or he found out very soon before it that he was going to be chairing it. So he chairing the intergroup, very little notice. There was an election, and two people had put their names in the hat, or the goblet of fire, shall we say. They'd put their names in the goblet of fire for this particular post. And one of them showed up, let's say Bobby showed up. Sally, who put her name in the goblet of fire, didn't show up. Sends her apologies to the intergroup meeting, which arrived 4 minutes after it started. The person would have known a good hour before they weren't going to make it because of where they lived. So not really following the protocol there to not show up for your election and not provide notification before the start of the meeting. So this chap, the chair, the ad hoc chair, made a decision that now he should have put it to the group and let the group vote, but whatever. He made the decision, which is perfectly defensible, perfectly reasonable decision. We've got only one candidate in evidence. Someone else showed an interest, but we've only got one candidate in evidence. So he proceeded with the election with the one candidate. The one candidate got it. And then the person who didn't brought a formal grievance, concept 5, against the decision. Now, this was handled so spectacularly badly. The way you handle this, by the way, you see, avoiding being personally punitive or an incitement to public controversy. To say to the person who didn't make it, there are going to be lots of other roles coming up. We really would like you to come on. So keep coming to the meetings. Here are the next 2 or 3 which are coming up. How about you go for one of those? Make sure you're able to attend the meeting where the vote is going to take place. And if you can't, give us plenty of notice, at least before the meeting starts. But we're not going to take this further. You may disagree with it, but it's not a serious matter. If you want to lodge a formal, have it formally minuted, we can add it to the minutes that you disagree with this decision. That would have shut it down, but instead they held a kangaroo court in the intergroup meeting where they got everyone to speak on the question, leaving the poor chair who had made the decision until last. And so just an appalling thing to do, because interestingly, anyone could have said in that intergroup, oh, excuse me, point of order, chair, there was someone else, I think we should wait until next time. But that didn't happen. So the intergroup failed. If you don't speak up at the time, you should not launch in on the side of a grievance later on when you could have spoken up at the time. Very, very bad form to let someone proceed and then holding the dagger behind your back and waiting until it's a fait accompli before getting the dagger out. It's a perfect example of where the chair was punished, frankly, for making that decision, and it caused controversy, completely unnecessary. A lot of these things can be a best discretion is the better part of valor, which is one of those obscure Shakespearean phrases, which whose meaning I think is deal with things quietly wherever possible. Don't go into battle with all guns blazing. That may be the brave thing to do, but it's not the wise thing to do. So try to resolve problems without having a public ding dong, and certainly without putting someone in the stocks, pillorying them at the meeting. What else? What have we got? Yes, another example of where there's a risk of public controversy is very rare in AA, but going to the police when a treasurer runs off with the money. Because when for the treasurer to run off with a significant sum, you've got to have, I'm going to swear, you've got to have shit procedures in place. If you've got good procedures, the money can be run away with only if there is collusion. It's actually very rare for the treasurer to run away with the money. It's vanishingly rare for theft from a meeting to take place through collusion between two people. In fact, I think I can think of one example in the last 30 years. So if you've got proper procedures which mean that you don't build up funds, you've got all of the evidence of the rent being paid demonstrated to the meeting, regular treasurer's reports, and the meeting is exercising its custodial oversight of the work of the officers, there's never a need that it just won't be possible. And any treasurer who wants to steal the money will not pick that group to do it. They'll predate a weak group. And it's a very similar situation psychologically as well. Do a shit job of custodial oversight and then shoot the person who you, through your poor custodial oversight, have allowed to behave in a way that you disagree with. If you've let it get to that point, I'm afraid you're as responsible as they are. So do not go to the police over it, because you won't get the money back. First of all, I've never seen the money retrieved from an alcoholic who's stolen it because they like money or they like stealing or because they've got drunk with it. They can't sick it back up. So stop pursuing them. Just put money in your own pockets and get it out. That's the best way to deal with it. And it does no good for a local police station to have this impression of AA, frankly. It's not. We want good relations with the local police station. We want them to send people to us. We shouldn't be sending people to them. Wrong flow of traffic. The one exception is calling the police when there's genuine physical threat to safety. Very often, the fact of calling them is enough to shut the behavior down very quickly. And I tell you, when you call the police on someone who is disruptive, very often the person is already known to the police. They know who they're dealing with. They greet them by first name. Oh, oh, pals. That's an exception because there is real common welfare. There's a genuine common welfare to be pursued at the cost of the potential public controversy. But also, I think it acts well. It acts in AA's favor because the police get the impression this is a group of people who are not to be messed with, who take safeguarding seriously, who take the safety of the meeting seriously. And I've seen police called an ambulances and all sorts of blue light services numbers of times, and they've always been very sympathetic to that. They're not terribly sympathetic to the treasurer running away with the dosh that you gave them. You see that I've seen them asking questions. You mean you just gave him the money? Oh, okay. And he what? He's run away, an alcoholic, run away with the money that you gave him. Oh, will get the squad car out, sir. They think it's slightly ridiculous. But with the personal safety stuff, they get it. And that's exactly what they're there for. Okay, next point, that though the conference may act for the service of Alcoholics Anonymous, it shall never perform any acts of government, and that like the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous, which it serves, the conference itself will always remain democratic in thought and action. Now, 2 points are acts of government. Very important to remember that the service structure serves the groups and its members, not the other way around. And I think it's been largely resolved now, partly through fudge and amnesia, the safeguarding procedures, which for AA, which when initially issued was not made clear, those were for activities of they did that in the safeguarding procedures issued by the board did not distinguish between the activities of the charity as such and the activities of groups. And it tried to legislate on, for instance, whether or not you could travel back from a meeting on the tube with a newcomer. What's a newcomer? If you're a newcomer, can you travel back on the tube with another newcomer? Do you have to wait till you're both years sober? And just really mad stuff. Hadn't been thought through. It's completely idiotic. London Region North wrote a 43-point letter to the General Service Board saying this is unworkable. These safeguarding procedures, first of all, make no sense. Secondly, cannot be interpreted because none of the terms are defined. And thirdly, run utterly against AA principles, and fourthly, won't achieve what you're seeking them to achieve anyway. That didn't get responded to. Now, over time, I think that they've softened the wording, and that they've turned it. There's a new document now. It's been incorporated into the materials, and I don't like it personally, but it's acceptable. Now, what was interesting is that it was written like an act of government. It was written like rules on how groups should operate sponsorship, saying that groups should make sure that anyone wants to be a sponsor should go and have the criminal screening check, whatever it's called. And it was really taken by groups as though it was a set of orders. It was written like a set of orders. DBS, that's it. I knew someone with a shifty past would come in with that. Very good. Each group, the groups are not answerable to anyone except themselves. I'm going to repeat that. The group is not answerable to anyone but itself. I think the only lever that can be, what do you do with a lever? Pull a lever. The only lever which can be pulled is to delist the group from the meeting listings. Very occasionally that's been done, for instance, where groups start to put out religious literature, on a table and mix it up with the AA literature. It's about the only time I've seen it done legitimately. There are times when I think it was Bristol and Avon intergroup tried to delist lots of the groups in their intergroup because they weren't sending GSRs. And well, we'll see about that. And they tried to tell, of course, it was an uproar and it didn't happen. But that's the only thing that AA as a whole can do. If the group wants to meet and call itself an AA group, it can. And if it breaches tradition 4, there's not a lot you can do. But where Bill is brilliant on this, more brilliant than he had a right to be in a sense, was saying it's the obedience to the unenforceable. It's a wonderful phrase, obedience to the unenforceable, from the 12 and 12. Because if the individual gets too far out of whack spiritually, they'll drink. if the group gets too far out of whack spiritually, people will stop going. And there was a meeting many years ago in Winchmore Hill, which started out excellent. It had a real core of big book people, very strong, but it got aggressive. But it got militant, lots of table thumping. And after 2 or 3 years of the table thumping, the group was just no more. It's a real shame because I used to travel all the way up to Winchmore Hill from Hoxton, which is a long way, on a Monday for it to take some people along with me. Great meeting while it was great. So I think it started to breach the traditions. But the other groups got very upset about it. Something needs to be done. Something was done. God did it. God, acting through the group conscience, told the individual people, stop going there, go somewhere else. And they didn't. And that was the end of the group. Very simple. There's a television series which a friend of mine suggested that I watch where a historical religious figure is talking about justice. He's talking to some kids about justice. And he says, yes, justice is important, but you let God administrate the justice. Don't take it into your own hands. And honestly, aberrations in AA, whether it's at individual level or group level or whatever, they tend to resolve themselves. There's between you and me and anyone listening to this on a podcast, there's a bit of a witch hunt going on right now against the board by persons. Well, they're known, some of them are known to me. Tried to get me inveigled in it. I wasn't having it. And I said to them, I don't want to hear anything about you. You can talk to me, but I do not want to hear about this because they were very upset at conspiracy theory stuff about the board. Very upset, very angry, but they weren't going through the service structure to try and sort it out. They were trying to create a parallel sort of center of power. And it's not how we do things. If you've got a problem, go to your GSR. And the GSR can go to the intergroup can go to the region can brief the delegate. And there is a long history of problems being identified by individual members, and it gets all the way to conference. One has to trust the structure, even if the structure is not entirely trustworthy. It's the best that we've got, and it's all that we've got. So I won't play any part in rabble rousing outside the structure to try to bring about change in AA. It's not how we do things. Last point about remaining democratic in thought and action. For those of you listening from galaxies far, far away, in this country a few years ago, the people were given a chance to have their say on something. Doesn't happen very often. It happens a lot in Switzerland. And look how rich they are. So, I suppose we must have thought, well, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. So we were given their say, and they had their say, and it was very, very slim, tiny little majority. And a lot of the voices said afterwards, well, because we've won this, democracy means that it must be implemented in full. And the other side, hard luck, you lost. And the argument would have been deployed the other way around. If the other side had won, I'm pretty sure the same argument would have been deployed. As though democracy is defined by, you have a vote, there's a simple majority, and then whoever gets the simple majority is in charge and F everyone else. And it's not democracy. That's one possible system among many implementing the principles of democracy. The democracy that is talked about in the concepts is not the democracy of the British constitutional constituency, rather, first past the post system, where someone, if they're the winner, that they might only have 30% of the vote in a constituency. The winning party may have only 30% of the national vote. There are situations where that is possible if you've got three parties which are very close and a cluster of smaller parties. there are very primitive ideas about what democracy is, very limited ideas about what democracy is. It's not get a bare majority and lord it over the rest. It's about, in AA's terms, in the concepts essays, and actually real de Tocqueville is mentioned in the concepts, other writers on the question of what democracy really is and the dangers of the tyranny of the majority over the minority, and indeed the other way around, the tyranny of the minority over the majority, when the most upset person in the room manages to get their own way because everyone just wants to go home and they don't like the tension, so they let some offended minority bully the room into pushing through some sort of proposal. There are lots of real dangers on both sides there. The real democracy is finding something which we can all broadly agree on, and it's a very, very tall order. Many years ago, I was very troubled by some political things. So I decided to read. I looked up the reading list given to people who are going to go up to Cambridge to study politics. What are they given to read over the summer before they go up? Because most of them haven't studied politics at school, so they're starting from scratch. And you get it's a very good way to get reading lists, by the way, to look at what people about to go up to university are asked to read before they go up. And I got a textbook of a history of politics. And within the first 2 pages, every single notion I had about what democracy was thrown out of the window. There was going to be another 1,998 pages. And I realized that everything I'd been told was just a tiny fraction, barely even made it onto the first 2 pages. Democracy is a very broad topic and a very interesting topic, and is not to be reduced to the idea of we've got a majority, fuck everyone else. That's not what it's about. Someone said, apparently some people with some questions. I've got some time, so I'm happy to move over to questions, Robert.
Has anyone got any questions for Tim? We honor his wisdom and experience by getting involved. I've got loads, sorry, but I don't want to hog it. I'll ask a few. Hopefully, it warm people up. In CA, we are looking to change Tradition 11, and there's a real passion and enthusiasm to do this. And what we've done is we've changed the safeguards in this concept from 3/4 of written consent from the entire worldwide fellowship of about 3,000 groups to 3/4 of those groups that respond in writing. So in theory, it could be 100 groups that get to change the tradition for the whole of the fellowship. How does that sit with concept 12? Unmute him, Nash, sorry.
There we go. Thank you. Well, I think the answer is automatic from the question. In practice, you have to make decisions at, let's say, region level without all of the groups represented, perhaps 1/5 of the groups represented. But that's because region must meet. It must make such decisions. It's got to do something. It's got to do some public information, for instance. The board has to have a website. You can't not do anything because you don't have a quorum. I'm extremely queasy about decisions which don't have the broad support of the fellowship, which arguably don't need to be made. My observation is a very informal observation. I've sponsored, and it's not like I've done a sort of systematic survey with a statistical basis, but I've noticed very curious a greater tendency towards legalism in CA than in AA. looking for clever ways round things, which actually subvert the principle in place. Presumably the reason why this decision is being made is you want to include internet. Is that
Correct? Yes, tradition 11 is changing from anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films to anonymity at the level of all public media. So it's deemed such a crucial threat to the fellowship that people are breaking their anonymity on Facebook. And I mean, in AA, they just wrote a pamphlet that said this also means breaking your anonymity at the public level on the internet, and that was it. That was the end of it. You know.
yes? I mean, the thing is, the spirit of step 11 is so obvious.
Tradition 11. Tradition 11.
Tradition
Yeah.
11. The spirit of tradition 11 is so obvious. One would really have to be yeah, I don't think you could honestly say, well, it doesn't say the internet, so it's okay to breach my anonymity there. You could only say it if you didn't understand, if you hadn't read what the tradition was. So I'm skeptical about the necessity of changing. I think it's self-evident what the principle is. What I'm queasy about is uh, setting a precedent on this one where I don't think if there was a change it would be harmful, but setting the precedent that you can put through changes on such a flimsy basis. There's a reason why they said 3/4 of all of the groups, why they carved that out rather than the majority of those in attendance and voting. There's a reason why. And that reason, I can't see why that reason would be changed. I'm queasy generally about changes to the traditions or the concepts. There was a decision in this country where they essentially overrode concept 4 and stripped the employees of the General Service Office a vote at conference. Now, they were only a tiny proportion of the voters at conference, so it's not like they were actually swinging decisions, but it sent a message that we don't care what you think, and it sent a terrible message to the staff. And it suggested that the board and the general secretary were above the other staff. Actually, I'm not sure about if the general secretary was included, but certainly the board, they get a vote because they're important. But the staff who are there all the time, much less important. And so anything which either seeks to change the traditions or concepts or to override them, I'm skeptical about. C.S. Lewis is very interesting about the question of novelty and progress and trying to bring things up to date with the times. And he lists these thousands of, well, not thousands, many examples of attempts with Christianity to bring it up to date with the times. Each one of those, each of them say, but Chris, the church will die unless we modernize. And it was brilliant. His list of modernizing movements, you haven't heard of any of them because they've all gone. But the thing that they said would die if it doesn't change was still there. So, yes, I'm skeptical about anything about changing things to bring them in line with current fashions and missing the principle and going down a legalistic route.
Brilliant. Thanks for your answer. I mean, we don't know if anyone else has got any questions for Tim, but we've kind of run out of time. So sorry.
I've got a couple of minutes if
Any more
there is another
questions,
question.
please? No. Okay. I've got another one. So I'm trying to keep this anonymous as possible. We had a situation where, and it was exactly like you said, a treasurer did take a large sum of money from a service body, And it was just down to what you said. It was down to complacency from us, and it was a large amount of money, and there wasn't any oversight, and it was basically down to people not wanting to take on that level of commitment and service. So, because and we weren't checking the bank statements, and they got internet banking, and they siphoned it off. Is it personally punitive to ask them to pay it back?
No, punitive will be going beyond what is necessary to get the job done. You want the money back, you ask for the money back. Punishment is the administration of retribution, and that's different. So amends are different than retribution.
And just to say, being a bleeding deacon, I was in the majority that was shouting to get this person arrested, and then I actually got an open letter from the trustees telling me, we're not personally punitive, Robert. Chill out, mate. And do you know what? It ignited my interest in learning the concepts. So out of a crisis, I started wanting to learn more about this stuff. Scott, hand up.
Yeah, I've got a question. Hello, Tim. Thank you so much, mate. Scott, grateful, recovered addict. This is my first time on this, and I found this really interesting. Thank you. My home group's getting a bit shouty. What should I do about it?
That touches on a larger question. How do you bring about change in anyone or anything? You can't. The most I've ever managed to do is to lead by example. There is a lever via sponsorship, but again, it's not deploying sponsees, it's leading by example. And with any luck, people will mimic whatever approach you're taking. Means there's a great responsibility as a sponsor to act well because people are watching. And sometimes, when I've gone through disagreeable phases, or should I say, some people find me disagreeable generally, should I say particularly disagreeable phases. And I see myself acting out with bad habits in meetings, and then I see sponsees doing the same thing. I think I've licensed that without realizing I was doing it. So one sets a good example oneself. That's what one aims to do. I have no compunction about changing groups and about changing home groups. I used to think, oh, I shouldn't do that, because you hear people, don't you, on tape saying, I've had the same home group since 1973, and if you're ever in Laguna Beach, then come and you join us. We'll be very happy to see that sort of stuff. Well, good for you. I'm so glad. I've had loads of home. If the spirit wants me to be elsewhere, I go elsewhere.
Be any space for like bringing in some awareness that is something that has been noticed, like let's say in a GC, something just being able to kind of say, look, I've noticed numbers dwindling. I've personally had sponsees who are now refraining from coming to this meeting. The treasurer, for example, might have left. Their post. Is there room for kind of bringing something like, what would the procedure be? Bringing something like that to the group's attention, and then like, is there anything that can be done? Because there are no, yeah. Is there anything that I don't know? Would there be space to bring that kind of thing up, or like you said, is it a case of just leading by example and hoping for the best?
Okay, so now there are two legitimate things that can be done. There are practical proposals that can be brought to the table for how certain things could be done differently. So, for instance, if there's very long sharing, you don't go into tirade about very long sharing. You say, hey, I think it would be a great idea if we had a bell which went off after 3 minutes. What does everyone think? So you propose something positive going forward rather than criticizing what is or has been. Because that just even if you're right, it just puts people's backs up. Now there is a time in the group, so it got to be careful with the term group conscience. Strictly, group conscience should be reserved for a group inventory, which is a spiritual endeavor, which is rather like the individual's own examination of conscience in step 11 at night, or in a further step 4, where the group runs down a series of questions, or maybe runs through the traditions. And I think the job is to leave it to the group, to each individual in the group, to examine their own conscience about their own conscience. So if you've been guilty of that yourself and have undergone a conversion, as it were, and understood that that doesn't work and doesn't help, and you're now doing it differently, you can say, well, you know, I used to ... and I realized that X, Y, and Z, and so now I do this. But I'd be very hesitant to point the finger in a group conscience and, you know, to go down the line of, well, people who shall not be named, and then especially don't report. Never. The two things you never do in a group conscience is say, is report the views of people who are no longer there, because they're not there to be cross-examined on that, as it were, or to have that really brought to account. It's unfair, very unfair evidence. And the other thing one never does, because it's such a dirty tactic, is, well, if I were new and I encountered this behavior, I'd probably never come back. Or, you know, or invoking the newcomers as though they're these sort of pathetic little milksops that can't tolerate anything. They're so sensitive and fragile, they'll run for the hills if anything is out of place. Someone once said to me, they've survived the crack houses of Hackney. I'm sure they can endure Sally banging on for 5 minutes about Jesus. Really. They're made of stronger stuff than that. So stick to yourself and don't go into the hypotheticals of, well, if I were new, but you're not new. So how do you know really? When I do that in a meeting, so this is what I find helpful right now, then you can do it. But honestly, if there's a bad smell spiritually in the room, you see that as soon as it goes down that line, the danger is the individuals might not be able to see it, might not be willing to see it in themselves. So needling them with it's actually just a much more polite form of doing the same thing.
I've got one more thing.
Robert.
Yes,
Yeah.
one more thing. So I got invited to. It was weird because I now, having attended your concept workshops a bit more, I know I shouldn't have probably done this, but I got asked as a DSR, which is kind of, I would say, as you'd call like a region rep, to come to a meeting, because they were shouting at each other there. Really, I mean, really shouting at each other. And in the end, we just sort of ran through the traditions a little bit and encouraged them to read the literature a bit more. And what they realised was that there was such a strict divide in the group that they just decided that they'd split up and start another group. They just left, and one of the great lines that came out of that for me was, this is supposed to be a business meeting. We're 40 minutes in, and we've just been shouting at each other, and we've got no business done. You know, it's like, how is this helping carry the message to the addict an alcoholic that still suffers? You know, and I thought that was quite powerful. So what I'm saying is, read the literature, get people to read the literature. You know, and then because we're meant to be on the same page, in the same boat. Anyway.
Yeah, there are a few little points on that. Firstly, if you have so much of this is down to very simple procedures, and I'll give you the simple procedure, that you only discuss what's on the agenda. The agenda is circulated in advance, and if someone wants to speak on a topic, they put their hand up and they speak only through the chair. And so you can't, no back and forth in the room, only through the chair in the order that the hands went up. No one speaks twice unless everyone has spoken once, Once everyone has spoken once, people are invited to speak a second time only and are only allowed to make substantively new points. No echoing the honourable member from Wigan. None of that. If you do that, there's a limit to how much damage the arsehole can do, because they've got and you have someone timing, and the timing system is when the bell goes off, you stop. No, this isn't a sign to wind up. It's just a sign to gradually slow down. And you're no, none of that. You stop. So you need, and so what you do, you encourage people. Say, and I've done this as I was the chair of a region group conference where I think it was someone actually here who I think was there, and I think I may have said at that one. Certainly, I have said it. Since you're only going to get one bite of the cherry before everyone else speaks on this, think very carefully before you put your hand up to make sure that you use your time wisely. That changes the whole thing. Secondly, the chair should have real power. And by that, I mean this. They have the power to say, let's go around the room and each of us say the Serenity Prayer once, each person individually, and then once we've done that, we'll start again. Or let's have 5 minutes silent meditation and someone read the step 11 prayer before we do that, and then we'll meditate for 5 minutes, then we'll start again. And to have the group actually respect the chair sufficiently that they let them do that. You delegate the power to be able to intervene in situations like that. And there's someone who I think gets a sort of lifelong medal for this. There was a nasty little business meeting at my home group a few years ago. And the chap said, well, obviously, there's so much disagreement in the room. We're not going to resolve this tonight. How about everyone put their views in writing? I will anonymize them and circulate them. And then people can read each other's views between now and next time. We'll have another discussion next time. Next agenda point. Just killed it. Perfect. And then when it was discussed the next time, people had calmed down, and some of the hottest heads in the room weren't there. And so there's often it's one or two people that I sometimes I work on clinical trials, and occasionally that I've seen protocols for how you deal with hamsters in clinical trials. And one of the things they say is if one of the hamsters gets spooked, they'll all get spooked. So you've got to be very, very careful about how you handle the hamsters. And it's like that in a business meeting. If one or two people kick off, it can kick everyone else off. And so sometimes it's just, if you reconvene, the person that was kicking everyone off is often just not there the next time. Often it's not only a small change that's required. Just reconvening is enough to solve those problems. So that's that on that. Are there any more?
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. That was great. Great advice. And there's a hamster emoji in the chat, which is great. So I think we could. I think that's been great. I mean, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Tim, and thanks everyone for contributing. Any more questions for any more? Okay. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Should we stop recording?